Well, happy Tuesday, everyone. Um, we'll get it started right on time. I know I got a couple messages from people. It's summertime, so I know summer plans, family, work, everything is in flux. So they would check out our discussion later. So we'll just go ahead and kick it off. So hope everyone is enjoying the warm weather outside and it's officially summer and school's out. So I have the agenda up here, and I think you guys probably get a sense from last time. I really like this to be a discussion, um, not super formal, but just so you guys have a general sense of what we'll kind of be discussing tonight. So I will just bear with me. I have lots of tabs open, just because I know we had some questions from last time, so I want to be able to pull it up. But what would a Zoom be without a PowerPoint? So just real quick, thought I would throw up a couple points. Same side as last time. Everyone be respectful of each other. Everyone here is here for the right reason. So just be positive. I want to do a quick update on the legislature. I think in every single group, I got a question about what they thought the legislature would actually do. Did they have the appetite to take on some of these education discussions and reform of the formula? And I just wanted to give a quick kind of overview of what's happened recently, and I think it's all relatively good news. So a lot happened just last week, and I can post these slides in our shared group. Um, so you can, these are all links, so you can learn a little bit more about each of these things. So last week there was a constitutional players convening, so they brought together like the governor's office, OPI, Board of Public Education, and the legislative education committees, the budget and interim committee. And they just basically had a discussion about education policy and what they wanted to look forward to in the next session. And a lot of the things we talk about, especially about teacher retention, and also like the burden on the taxpayers, how the levies weren't that successful, all of those things were discussed during this and these other meetings. Then there was also interim committee hearings last week. So there was an interim budget committee hearing and an interim education committee hearing. Also discussions about looking forward to next session and how things have been implemented from the previous session. A lot of things they talked about in there are also the things that we talked about here, a lot of teacher retention stuff. So a lot of the issues that we're talking about the legislature seeing, and they're looking at it and taking it seriously. And then also last week there was Ledge Days, and I think this should be good news for everyone that during Ledge Days they brought in legislators from across the state, so not just the education legislators or the legislators who are on the education committee. Everyone came in. They had these like breakout groups about different topics, and two of the breakout groups were just about school funding. So this is a hot topic for the legislature. So I think that's really good news that they are taking it seriously and there is an appetite to take it on. So now I'll exit the silly PowerPoint. I have to do it. And I wanted to bring up kind of the summary page. And this is notes that I jotted down from things that you guys talked about and kind of just summarize it, top line bullet points. So we could take a look at this and start to talk about the issues that we identified last week and start talking more about solutions and where we would like to see solutions go. I know there was a number of questions too, so I promise I'm going to shut up very quickly, and then you guys, I want to hear from you guys. But I know there was a couple questions last week, not last week, last month, that I wanted to come back and answer, and some of the questions overlapped with other groups. But I know there were some questions about like the rural funding grants, specifically for rural schools. So I know probably you guys are more knowledgeable than on some of these grants than I am, but there's two federal grants in particular that rural schools usually go after or are funded with. It's the SRSA grant and the RLIS grant. They both go to rural schools. They're just operated slightly differently. One is directly, the funding comes directly from the federal government to schools, and the other one, it goes through OPI before it goes to schools. There was also some, I think, questions about where like the marijuana money goes in this group. I think in some of the other groups, they also talked about where some of the like lottery money goes. And I think also we talked about rental properties and how those are taxed here and other places or second homes. And right now, there's no cities or states that tax like a second home at a higher rate for out of state people. But there are some cities who have experimented with that. Pass like doing a second home tax or a vacant property tax where someone's not occupying that property for at least a certain period of time, that there is a higher tax on that property. There's been proposals in California, similar second home for out of state people. They're trying to capture actually people who have moved out of California and claiming residence somewhere else to get lower taxes. But that's something they've played around with too. Where actually in-state residents for their second home get to write off that, take those taxes off. But if you're an out-of-state resident for that home, you do pay 1% more. So those are proposals that have been kind of bandied about in other states. And then I won't go too much into where all of the marijuana money and stuff goes to because I want us to get to discussion. But I am going to jump over real quick to our share drive for resources. There's a couple links in here. And so, for instance, the history of the lottery, of where that money goes to. You guys can take a closer deep dive in this if you haven't already. Check out the resources on there. But I just wanted to kind of show you what's on here. It shows where all the lottery money went. In the beginning, it was going to teacher retirement obligations, and it has changed a little bit over the years. Some of the money can go to STEM, like CTE type of scholarships. But overall, there's not too much of the lottery money going to education. But there's a number of things like that in this share drive that can kind of go into more of that information. One other document I wanted to share that's in there, but I wanted to bring it up because this was presented at one of the committee hearings last week, and it was about teacher retention, which every single group has talked about. It's a topic across the nation. So for teacher retention, there was a couple of things I really wanted to highlight. I found interesting facts, but I know this graphic isn't super beautiful, but what are some of the factors that drive teacher turnover? Of course, we could talk about salary, and we should talk about salary and compensation, but other things to keep in mind are like the workloads, the poor working conditions, the lack of mentorship. All of this does feed into it. It's shown in studies, and it's just something that we should keep in mind. And then for some of the other stats I wanted to highlight was the turnover in schools. And a couple interesting stats is right here. I thought was the really high turnover with special education and with science, also with gifted and talented. But I thought the most startling number, and I don't think anyone will be surprised, is the first year of teachers experience a 30% turnover. So we're losing a lot of teachers in that first 5 years. So we have to think about the costs that schools go through to keep having to hire teachers every couple years because they're not keeping those newer teachers. So this document's in there. There's a ton of stats. Another stat specifically for this group, I think, especially talking about the rural and smaller schools, that only 4 reservation schools didn't experience turnover. So most reservation schools had turnover. So I don't think any of these are surprising stats, but it's interesting to look at to kind of understand the problem that we're looking at. So I won't go into too much more of that because I want us to get talking about what we talked about last time. I want to hear your thoughts if you've had any thoughts over the last month, if you had a chance to check out any of those resources or check out anything on your own time. So I'm going to stop talking. Although while we chat, I will leave this summary up just so we can refer back to it. I'm kind of using this to help group things into categories to help build the like skeleton of the white paper. So again, I'm going to shut up now. What do you guys have to say? quiet at the moment.
Well, I missed the first meeting, um, so I don't know what was discussed at that one or what problems were brought up. So if someone would like to tell me, I would greatly appreciate it.
Well, and Kira, do you want to quickly introduce yourself? Because I know you're here in your personal capacity, but you also have an official capacity at OPI.
Yes, I am the family engagement specialist for OPI, and I live in a very rural part of Montana. So that was why I wanted to be a part of this budget and education working group.
Awesome. Well, Kira's a great resource, everyone. And then here, what I have up on the page, what I mentioned is the summary of a lot of the things that we talked about. Um, since I mentioned it a few times in the kind of kickoff, and it's the first item on here, do we maybe want to revisit some of the issues we talked about with teacher retention, um, and ways that we see the legislature, or steps that we can see the legislature to take going forward?
I think that sounds good, Katie. I'm gonna I'm just finishing up cooking dinner right now. But I would go over kind of what I recall, but I don't know if you remember, I was about halfway late to our last meeting because I had soccer coaching duties. Um, but something I've been thinking about over the last month, like I know we talked about the lottery, I know that we talked about VRBO, Airbnb type of properties. And we talked about the marijuana money as well, as potential resources. And the only one I really had much time to kind of look into with the end of the year and everything was the marijuana money. And it seemed like a lot of that, I didn't get too deep into it, unfortunately, but um, it looked like a lot of that, not maybe not a lot, that's not fair, but there was a good allocation for fish, wildlife, and parks with maybe some left over going to schools and the general funds. Does that, okay, Kira, I see is kind of nodding there, maybe.
I did a deep dive into this.
Oh,
And
awesome.
so that was part of the reason I got offered this job because I was basically deep diving into my kids' education
Yeah.
and budget and things like that. And you're 100% right. There is a lot going into, forestry,
Yeah.
basically. Um, and I have personally had conversations with different politicians, um, not on like a super high level, but like House representatives and things. And I have been told multiple times that it's very political.
Yeah.
So, but
Yeah.
I
And
agree
I
because
don't
I
want to
was
take
like,
money away from, one pot to fill another pot. That also doesn't seem fair, but
no, but when I looked at the amount of money, I was like, I don't know how they would even spend all of that
yeah.
money, if
Yeah.
I'm being honest, is a lot. And I think that, when it became legalized, um, I truly do not believe that most powers that be had an understanding of the astronomical amount of money that was going to be coming in from that.
Hmm.
And so I think that there's people who think, oh, I don't want drug money going to my kids,
Hmm.
and then I'm of the mind like the money's coming in, like if that's what we can use it for, let's fund education.
Hmm.
Um, but I do think it's a very taboo thing, unfortunately. But you're right, there is quite a large amount going towards that.
Do and I have looked through that sheet that you shared, Katie, but I need to look. I was trying to get it pulled up and then I wanted to say something and I had too many screens open. But um do we have the information I found was a lot of percentages and didn't necessarily talk about what we're actually looking at for numbers in there. I'm just wondering if it would be like pulling from different pots, like a little bit here, a little bit there, a little more from lottery. I
Do
think,
we have what is that report called, Katie? Maybe you
I
can
know,
help me. The
I was like, I know
buy,
I had that number and I
well, I was gonna
just,
say, isn't it like the buy,
here, I'm gonna stop sharing so I could click around without you guys.
isn't it the buy, like not the bicentennial, but the buy, oh, what is it? That, like
Well, there's the governor's biennial budget. Is that what you're like referring to?
maybe
Or
that's
not?
what I'm thinking about, because I
But I was
thought
like, I
that
know
had
I
an
do
actual
have the
breakdown.
specific numbers. Um, It might be, okay, here we go. Let me share again. Sorry, I didn't want to have to, but so the Montana Department of Revenue, and I could put this link in there too. This is a breakdown of sales up until May of 2024. So it's a lot. So they
Which,
brought in $122 million in taxes.
that's in taxes? Oh my gosh.
There was $752 million in sales.
Yeah.
So I'll
Given
throw
that's over
this,
a 2-year period, but still.
yeah, that's quite a bit of money. So I'll throw this resource in here. So then, yeah, so this is in there now. So if you guys wanted to click around and kind of, I mean, it has it broken down by month too. So you can actually like see the trends, um, which has gone down a little bit. That's most states have like a peak and then it levels out. But um, yeah, that information. There was also, I'm not sure if it was this group, and I apologize, but I did find it interesting just to kind of see and apologize. I have quite a bit of tabs open. I'm hoping I didn't close that I wanted to show you guys. Oh, this is a couple years out of date. This is the Center for Research and Rural Education. But it is kind of showing how much like rural education is a big part of Montana, more so than any other state. So it is just a nice stats on how rural Montana is, but and also that vacancies. This is like I said, this is a couple years out of date, but still 83% of teacher vacancies were in this.
okay, sorry, I just got our dinner all dished up. So now I'm like actually able to focus better. That's
Wanted to show
funny.
because there was questions about, okay, hold on, I'm gonna stop the share while I find it. There was questions about also like resource revenue, mineral revenue, and how much of that goes to school. So you guys can continue to discuss something while I pull that up, but it's also just an interesting thing of where some of the revenue.
So I found, Caitlin, 20% goes to um, the Department of Revenue, like 20% of retail sales, and then 4% goes there as well. And then I'm trying to find 20% goes to fish, wildlife, and parks. 4% goes to the state parks. 4% goes to trails and recreational facilities. 4% goes to non-game wildlife. 3% or 200,000, whichever is less, goes to veteran affairs. 150,000 goes to crime control and crime team training, and the remainder goes into the general fund. So,
Yeah, that's not I can't
32.
imagine that that's a lot left. That's the paper that I came across there, or the
Yeah,
resource.
because if you were to take, let me
So it would
see here.
be 20% of 122 million, which is the 2022 to projected 2024, or was
Yep,
that?
so if you take 122 million and then take out 24, 28, 32, 35, well, no, so you'd have to take out 35%, 39, so roughly, let's say 40%. Oops.
And then quickly while you're doing that math, what I just put up is what like our public trust lands. So the federal government ceded over 5 million acres to Montana for common school support. And then the land board has the authority to direct control, lease, exchange, sell like some of this land to fund schools. So this is for the 2023 fiscal year. I don't have the finalized 2024 fiscal year numbers yet, obviously. But the trust lands contribute 5% of total OPI expenditures. It ends up contributing about 57 million because of the 9 million goes to school facility and technology fund. And then 48.6 million goes to the general fund, common school general fund, and that's about $323 per student. So again, it gives a good perspective of kind of where some of these funding streams are coming.
Mhm.
Well, so to get back a little bit more from the conversation at hand, so we were talking a little bit about teacher retention, and specifically some of the hurdles that smaller school districts are having to. I know we touched on this last time to recruit. There's a couple reasons for that, but also to get them to stay in the community. So do we want to build out a little bit more of what we're seeing with that? I know a lot of it comes back to salary. If you guys want to talk a little bit or give some thoughts, and then I can talk about for the proposals, or it was a very broad idea brought up by one of the legislators.
Uh, I mean, I can kind of speak to what I've just seen in the district that I just left, which is it's a great district, but there's a money question, a levy failed. Um, but I think, you know, going back to that graphic that you showed a little bit ago, it's a high stress environment. There's a new school board, and there's all those political things too. And they're removing programs that teachers find very supportive. Um, Questionable whether or not that was a financial decision. Certainly, if there's, a financial incentive, I think people are more likely to stay, but less so in salary. I mean, I think they've done a lot of studies and they've found that that's not necessarily the number one reason why teachers leave. It's really, are they supported and do they have the resources that they need? I think people, colleges, that's one thing they do a very good job at is telling teachers you're not going to make a ton of money, right? So they're not necessarily going into that profession thinking that we are going to make a ton of money. So that's, but when you remove those other supports, whether that's for budgetary reasons or other reasons, that adds extra stress, which was one of those reasons on your graphic there as well.
Well, and I feel like a lot of it too, because I mean, if you rack your brain, you're not going to be able to come up with a single teacher that's like, oh yeah, I do it for the money. Like, no, you know what I mean? Like the teachers that do it are like the only ones I can think of that are technically even doing it for the money is the ones who were like 5 years from retiring. And they're burnt out and they're done, but they're doing it just trying to get to like that retirement.
Yeah, our health insurance.
Yeah, but I feel like the majority of them, of teachers that are leaving, and I've done a little bit of digging because like 2 years ago, Texas lost, oh gosh, it was like 40% of their teachers quit in the year. And so I watched interviews and everything of like what's going on, and all of them, it came down to respect. it came down to lack of respect, especially by students, but lack of respect and support by administration and other teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's, I think that's a big part of it. And I spent a ridiculous amount of time last fall interviewing staff at my kids' school because I was a sub at their school. And so I spent hours interviewing and asking questions and what are you happy about? What are you not happy about? And one of the things that I constantly heard was too much responsibility on top of their regular duties. So not just teaching, but then they were required to take tickets and they're required to, you know, you've got 2 recess duties today. And by the way, you're a kindergarten teacher, which means you also don't get to eat lunch by yourself. And like, all of these things. And I was like, this is a problem. Like, we're a month into the school year. And if you go in there, they're done. Like, they look like it's the last month, not the first month. And I think that that's a problem across the board based on the phone calls that I get from parents and everything else. That's exactly it, it's a huge problem.
I think to build upon that, one of the things that was brought up by the special education group was kids that are not necessarily, kids who would be designated with an IEP, but they're having extreme behavioral problems, especially post-COVID, and having the support to address the students' the behavioral needs that don't fit into the current categories, but do need that extra.
Yeah.
I think a lot of I can say this in my own kids' school, but based on the phone calls that I'm getting as well, there are so many like paraprofessionals and things like that in schools they're glorified babysitters. That's what they are. They're going and following a kid around who has massive behavioral problems. And forgive me for saying this because sometimes there is a special need. However, the schools are issuing 504s to kids who have ADHD and don't listen and don't get the word no at home. And that's the truth of it. And so these kids are hyperactive, they're completely defiant and don't listen. And so then someone is having to be exhausted all day long by following these kids around in the classroom and just trying to get them to listen, meanwhile being told, oh no, you can't tell them no, or you can't do this, or you can't do this. And it's exhausting. I mean, I've watched it day in and day out, and I'm just like, my heart breaks for them when I'm seeing it happen. And I've gotten calls from parents and paras and staff and things like that. And it's a statewide problem. It very much is a statewide problem where, they're just taking a beating, for lack of a better term. And there isn't any hope in sight. And then kids who possibly do have special needs, which do deserve extra understanding and empathy, but some of them are literally just getting away with things that shouldn't be tolerated. And so, getting a phone call from a parent who unfortunately is like, yeah, my kid was threatened in class. This isn't the first time, this isn't the 10th time, but they don't have anywhere to take that student to another room. So they're leaving them in the classroom. And the whole classroom gets evacuated. And it's just, and it's underfunding. And they don't have the money to create an extra safe space somewhere.
I went to school in the South, and you could still paddle the kids if they misbehaved. And I'll tell you what, we thought twice about messing up.
My husband and I have had that conversation numerous times that there used to be a fear of if there was a call home. You were afraid. You did not want to get a call home. And now the teachers are afraid to call home. Most teachers are afraid.
Problem is no consequences. You give kids no consequences, they're going to do whatever they want.
I think overall there's a decrease in respect for the profession. And like you guys were saying, it's, yeah, you call home and there's not only are there no consequences, but the parent is oftentimes displeased with how the teacher did handle the situation.
Or they don't answer.
And the students are emboldened. Yeah, there's that too. Um, but leading to teachers leaving the profession, just like they're seeing that during the day and then the news all the time and then levies fail. And I mean, I think it gets disheartening to a lot of people very, very quickly. Like
They don't feel
desperate years.
supported by the
Right.
community. And I think that's a big thing, because while money is important, at least if you have the community showing up and supporting you, it makes a huge difference in how long someone stays at a school.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And going back to that administration comment as well, I think that that's really important as well. And that side of things is not doing fantastic either. Admin are in need all over the state.
So does the public schools not have a three strike you're out policy? Because the private schools do. Like you mess up 3 times, it doesn't matter how long you've been there, you're done, you're out. Period.
I think it depends on the school. I will say that it does. I mean, there's no cookie cutter when it comes to that sort of thing. I recently became aware of a certain school from several parent phone calls where it appears that if a kid is being bullied, then they will offer them remote distance learning to get the kid to learn at home to avoid dealing with the bullying situation. Then
So the
you've got
consequences for the kid being bullied, not for the person bullying.
Yeah.
Yes.
Awesome. That's freaking great.
So that's, one situation where I've gotten several parent phone calls. That's the way that it appears to be. And then, it depends on if the kid has special needs. Unfortunately, there's a lot of times where they do get away with more, because ultimately, to expel a student, it has to be approved by the school board. And so it depends on who's on that school board. It depends on which way the superintendent wants to vote with it. So there was a student in my kids' school that had brought he had an IEP, and he had brought a paintball gun to a sporting event. And he didn't pull it out, but it was in his backpack. Someone told on him, and he was suspended. They were looking at expelling him. And they did end up giving him like restricted access for the rest of the year to the school. I think he came in like an hour a day or something like that, and then the rest of his learning had to be at home. And they did give him another chance, and he was allowed to come back. And once his behavior declined again, the school board did vote to remove him. But it was a big thing. There was teachers who felt bad for him because he had a bad home life. And there was teachers on the flip side saying, okay, but he's obviously a threat to our school, so he shouldn't be here. And so I feel like there's constantly that tug of war is what's happening.
And Kira, what's the program? And I know it joins a little bit. What's the program? It's based in Dillon, and it's like a regimented program for high school students. It's military-esque.
Oh, yeah,
Why am I blanking on the name?
I know,
I
and
feel
if you
silly.
hadn't asked me, I could have told you.
But you have to have buy-in from the parents and from the student. But it's a student who may have behavioral issues, not getting along in the great environment. But I went to their a dinner with the students there, and the students there were really impressive. You could tell like they were thriving in that environment. It's not for everyone, but it is an option in the state of Montana, and it's just with the students there. I I was very impressed with the program. And now I feel bad I'm forgetting it.
Montana Youth Challenge Academy.
There we go. Thank you.
That's what it is. I had to look it up. That was going to drive me crazy all day.
But to talk a little bit about some of we started talking about the burden that the teachers and administration feels. One of the things that they brought up was sharing in the legislative hearing was sharing more resources, as in sharing teachers between smaller districts. So if you have a specialized teacher, maybe a specialized science teacher or a music teacher, where schools that are within, a closer area can share that teacher. So the teacher spends 2 days at one school, 3 days at another school. And I know there's some extent that this can happen, but what do you guys think about facilitating more of that?
I would love that. There's a ton of tiny little schools near us, and one class B or two, I guess two class Bs, but three, four, five class C schools. And I think that that would be, right now our kids haven't had band for 3 years after the music teacher retired. For a couple years, it was classroom teachers were teaching like this, teaching music and art as a special. And then this year it was kind of on like your own classroom. You were just going to teach music and art, which no one wants to hear me sing. Um, I think that would be a great idea.
Actually, I had that growing up. My music teacher was shared with another school.
Yeah,
So
that's
I
awesome.
was like, when I was like, oh, that should be how I grew up with
Yeah.
that. I didn't grow up in Montana when I was little. So
I've
well,
heard that for like that idea for superintendents as well.
that was
Which
something brought up. Because, well, one of the things they brought up in the committee hearing, and I'm just telling you what they said, I'm trying to be an impartial arbiter of
you're
information.
doing a great job.
One of the things they brought up was comparing Montana to other states and was showing that Montana has over 800 schools and 400 school districts. And in states that compare, if we're looking at Wyoming, North Dakota, Idaho, it's not nearly that. So when people are looking at that, and it's been brought up, it squeezes the matrix. So you have a lot of people at the top making a lot of money. It squeezes the matrix for the amount of money newer entry level teachers. That might not be. I don't think that's a one size fits all measure in how we're talking about it. And I understand why there's mixed feelings, but I do think it's interesting to look at because Montana does stick out compared to any other state in the amount of school districts, let alone schools.
Yeah, in my state, it was after I had graduated high school, but they started consolidating several schools. And I mean, it was a big thing. It was very upsetting to a lot of people. And, I think it would be upsetting here. Um, but at the same time, after what I've just seen in this past negotiation round and levies and all of this, I don't think the community support is there. There are people who are very supportive, but it seems to be the minority at this point. And, that could very well be because we're at this like breaking point where there, property taxes have increased so dramatically and people just can't afford it. That's part of it. And, culture wars and all of that. Um, that maybe it's a good time to look at some type of consolidation. But kind of what I was talking about before, I mean, from my perspective, I think I'd say like it can't just be that. Like if it could somehow, the legislature could somehow combine that type of consolidation with like, and we're going to pull more funding from these other resources, I think that would be more palatable to a lot of people.
And one of the other things discussed during the committee was how to strengthen the quality educator payment. So there's been like I would say like a range of proposals, but I'll summarize it in two kind of sentences of what overall people are looking at, but in a range. So really giving more money to the quality educator payment, so tying more money to the individual teachers and putting less emphasis on the A and B count. That was something put forward by like Lance Melton. But then in general, the legislature is looking at ways to strengthen the Teach Act to either widen who's eligible, increase the payments, stuff like that. So, but like I said, there's like a range of when you're looking at that. You can just increase the payments a little bit, increase eligibility, put a lot more weight to that. So, but
Is that
that's
the highly qualified teacher program that you're okay?
yeah.
And that's like,
so this year they get, it's $3,000 and change, or 33,
and
30.
part has to be covered locally, but most is covered
Well,
state.
that's the extra incentive. So
Okay.
the schools have to have, has to be teachers within their first couple years of teaching, and then they have to, their salary level has to hit a certain point. So they're incentivizing the salary level to be at a certain level, and then they get an extra $3,000 from the state to kind of to incentivize that higher salary.
Yeah.
So you could, right now, the incentive is like over a little over $3,000. So you could look at putting that incentive at $5,000, or again, a more overhaul where you do less emphasis on A and B, more emphasis on the amount of teachers you want to put in that school, and tie more funding to the teachers. Some arguments for that, right? It's if you have a school, especially small schools, you have a family leave that can pull 5 students out, you still have a 5th grade, 4th grade, but you lost a handful of students. How you can't get rid of that class. So you still
Yeah.
have to pay for that teacher. So that's one of the arguments of tying more money to the teachers.
Mm-hmm. I like that approach versus like I was thinking while you were saying that, I was like, oh, it'd be interesting to have more incentive for getting like a master's degree or higher education so that that's kind of, steps and lanes. But you could always leave the state with your master's degree, whereas, um, and so the state kind of loses out on that completely. But um, yeah.
Well, and I kind of have a different perspective on this only because I have the unique perspective of being a sub for 3 years. So I worked in every classroom, like I really got like that first hand knowledge, but I also worked in the business office. So then I knew how much every teacher in the school was making.
Mm.
So there were certain individuals that had a master's degree that were making way more money, but they also were so active in the school. Like they ran various programs, and things like that. They clearly don't do it for the money. They're passionate about it. Then we have another teacher who's up there with that salary, who is a counselor. 90% of the time she's in her office, literally, and she taught a life skills class, and then she supervised MTD Academy with like 8 kids who took classes online. She's making over double what some of our elementary teachers are, that their jobs are way more stressful, but because she has the master's degree, she's making more money. Even though she's teaching less, her job requires much less. And so I'm like, kind of from that perspective, I'm like, oh, that's not, like I know that life's not fair, but I'm like, that's really not fair. Like
Yeah.
we're paying, we're gonna lose these, in
Good
her
teachers.
position, like, not to say that we could do without her, but we kind of could do without her. Versus our elementary staff, when you look at like who can you know, do without, or, who is irreplaceable, because like our school pays, like, I don't even think we're paying our cooks or anything, like not even $12 an hour. And I'm like, that's, in my personal opinion, the most important job in school, because if you don't have food, nobody's showing up. So I'm like, and it's the hardest. Like I did that position. It's the hardest one in the school, as far as physically demanding. It's thankless. I even had someone who came up to me who was a staff member and was like, oh, so you'll just do any job they give you? And I was like, this is the most important job in the school. Like, how dare you? You're eating right now, So, yeah, like I'm all for you know, the incentive and everything, but I think sometimes it does backfire that way, where someone's getting paid more who has a master's, but they might be doing a fraction of the work. So
That's a really good point.
I'm just going to throw out ideas I saw in other states too. But I see pros and cons with this too. So Oklahoma has a program now because they also have a teaching shortage. So they're trying to encourage students to go into the teaching profession. So they have sign-on bonuses. So if they sign on to be a teacher and stay for a certain amount of years, they get pretty decent bonuses. It was $15,000 if you were in state, and which was even more interesting. They gave a higher bonus if you're out of state that came in. $25,000 for a teacher to move to the state if they had a license. It's pretty interesting. So they're actually accepting applicants for that right now. So we'll see how it.
Do you think it has to do with like a moving stipend though? Because that would make sense to me because a
Well,
lot
I
of
think
companies will offer like,
I think that's some of it. Yeah.
yeah.
I would need more encouragement to move to Oklahoma over Montana too. No offense to Montana.
I was gonna say the
But I
same
like
thing, but
Montana more.
you have to move to Oklahoma.
No offense. I like Oklahoma. I just like Montana
I
more.
have a very good friend, we've been friends since high school, who lives like between Montana and Oklahoma, and we joke about it all the time. Like all the time. So
My
yeah.
sister's husband was based in Oklahoma for a couple years. They don't miss it.
So that might be why they throw that extra 10 on. But yes, for taking in that moving into account, moving no matter what costs a lot of money. Even if you're really good at it. I'm very good at it. I move a lot, but still costs a lot of money. So it is something which I'll bring it in talking about some of the things we talked about last time was the housing shortage, housing, how do we address housing, the cost of living for teachers. So I understand everyone feels the same way about inflation, that the inflation rate and the cap, it hasn't kept up with the actual cost of turning the lights on in the school. So that's straightforward. But talking about housing, um, there are ways right now current schools could build housing for teachers and rent it out, like have teacher housing. Now, obviously, schools don't have the extra money to do that, but it's interesting to think about either housing kind of vouchers, tax breaks for people who rent to teachers at, certain levels, or like I said, pilot program maybe that gives grants to communities to build housing. There's some schools that have extra land that they can use or sell to have the housing. So those are all things.
I know Bozeman has done, there was a school in Bozeman that did something where they built a bunch of teacher houses. And I'm not sure if they then sold them to teachers and there were just like an easement on them for how they could be sold again in the future. Um, I feel like it was on the north side, but I can't think of where it was. Um, but when we taught in Poplar, they had teacher housing up there, and of course, there's a lot of federal funds that are intertwined in there as well. But
I was
it's
gonna say, I feel like it's one of those things where certain areas, do have a lot more funding for various things. And then, like our school, and I think this faces a lot of schools, our buildings are old. Like we live in Montana, and a lot of our buildings are very old, which means we're paying more for our heating and our cooling and, you know,
improvements,
yes,
repairs.
for any kind of improvements, because one of the things that I had brought up, and I know other people, like my kids' schools, because of consolidation, like you said, in little towns, our high school and our elementary school are 12 miles apart. And so, and then you factor in like our school district and how big it is and how far the buses have to go, and everything like that. And there is a lot of overhead on two buildings and, two cooks at each building and maintenance at each building. And then from working in the business office, I saw the bills from Northwestern. And so I was like, why can't we consolidate into one building? Well, because now the basement in the building that, back in the day, that was the one building, isn't usable anymore. And they don't have the funds to fix that. And so like the COVID ESSER dollars for our school that we got are going to fix the teacherages because they haven't been worked on in like 20, 30 years. So they're doing like literally necessary updates, and they're redoing our HVAC system because there were days I would come into school and the classroom I was going into was 108 degrees. And then you would go in and it was 52 degrees. And so it's like they're doing those things and that's great, but at the same time, it's not actually gonna like lower the bills, you know, or anything. They're still gonna be astronomical. And I think there's a lot of schools that are really old like that, that it's kind of like a money pit almost, you know?
Like
So I
Tom
put up,
Hanks.
and I'll throw it, I put this in another group because they specifically brought up this study and wanted to see it, but I'll put it into our group share drive as well. It's from 2008, so I know it's very dated, and there's some stuff in it that's outdated. There's a lot of stuff in there that still
I was
rings
gonna say it's
true.
probably relevant, yeah.
So there's some schools like Billings did a pretty decent sized upgrade since then. So I think like the stuff about Billings in here will be outdated. But it is interesting to look at like how little stuff has changed since 2008. But this is a really comprehensive study that the legislature had done back then on facilities. So I'll throw that in there because it is interesting to look.
Yeah.
And you know, a lot of building maintenance does rely on the local taxpayers. There's very little of the building maintenance that comes um, outside of local. Um,
You
and
also have to
then
have contractors, and we live in the middle of nowhere. That's been one of our biggest struggles is that, you know, we've been trying for 2 years to bring in a contractor who could work on our HVAC. Like, you know, we can't get contractors to work on these things because we don't have them because we live in the middle of nowhere. And so, you know, getting someone to come and all of that, it's a lot. It's really hard.
I know I sometimes I regret my career choices. I feel like I should have went into HVAC because people I know went into HVAC are busy all the time.
Yeah.
Making good money.
Good for them.
Good for
But
them.
tell your students like, oh, if I could go back in time, I'd be like,
Go
oh,
into the trades.
HVAC.
I
Let me
wonder, going back to that, like teacher housing, if there could be some combination of um, taxing like VRBOs, Airbnbs, or out of state second owned homes with the potential for a rebate if you rent that to like a high needs profession, or specifically teachers or, you know, somebody in education.
Which would help if it was in a spot, you know, where like we don't, you know, we don't even have hard, like we don't have rentals, you know what I
Yeah.
mean, like around where we're at. And, um, you know, I closest Airbnb is probably like 45 minutes away.
Yeah.
So
We're in
that's,
Carbon County, so there's like a huge, the mess. There's not enough housing.
yep.
and
Pretty hot topic.
I had
I
mentioned
don't
that
think there's
in a couple of meetings as well, is that I don't think that's a horrible idea. And I think that people would appreciate it if there was an incentive, if it was coupled with the fact that a second home tax or a vacation home tax was implemented. And then, because of course they're going to say, oh, I don't want to be taxed that much money. But then if you couple it with, okay, but we'll give you an incentive if you rent out your home that you leave empty 50 weeks out of the year to the fire department people or the police department or teachers.
Well, I think there's people even doing it because of traveling nurses. I know that's a big one. Like I had to go stay in Wolf Point for the school tour I did this spring. And I found this Airbnb online. I thought for sure it was a scam. I mean, like it was breathtakingly beautiful. And no offense, but it was in Wolf Point. And I was like, this is probably a scam. Like, but it was literally, it was it. It was the only one listed. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to take a chance on it. And it was legit. I mean, it was absolutely gorgeous. It was so pretty and everything. And I was like, how do they do this here? And I was like, oh, I bet there's traveling nurses and things like that because it's always booked, always booked.
Yeah. And it could be, and in some areas that might be really successful. And there might be other areas of Montana that you have to take a different approach because Montana does differ so much in so many areas. So one size fits all doesn't work. But um I do think that's a really interesting option to look at. And then like if you you can couple that. But like you said, it's an incentivization where you don't have to be punished if you step up in the community. But that's something like outside the legislature, how you bring in the community more of saying like especially if you're not renting your house out and it's unoccupied, if you're renting it, then you're renting it to a teacher who's someone who's has a background check, who's vetted, who's actually in your house caring for it. Like there's incentives for someone to want to rent it out, let alone like the money. It's you have someone like mowing the lawn or like bringing in the mail,
Upkeep,
making
yeah.
sure
Yeah.
like it's not, especially nowadays, squatters isn't as much of an issue in Montana, but I see it all the time if
That's
you
in
leave
New
a house
York.
unoccupied. Yeah. So there's ways we can, incentivize that. And I bet there's people in the community who would be willing to do those things, but they don't even know how to offer that, and people don't know to ask them.
Or how high of a need it is too.
Right.
I mean, I think people might see like the broad story, like, oh, it's really hard to find housing for like the ski hill or whatever, but they're not seeing like, for teachers too.
Mhm. I think there's ways that, like, obviously, there's the bigger issues of how to fix the funding formula, making sure teachers can live in their communities. But I also think there's smaller things that we can do to help leverage the community. There's people who want to volunteer. And sometimes we're just not matching like the need to like the talent.
Yeah.
Um, so if there's ways that we can, and that's not a cost, that's might not even be a legislative thing. That might be how can we facilitate the community to come together to match those things. Um, and
Well,
that
it's hard too
it's
because between housing and just a lack of things to do, it's one thing we talk about here up on the High Line because there's nothing for us to be like, yeah, come here and hide from the wind. Like, like there's not, like attractions. And so we can't pay you well. We don't have any attractions, like it makes
There's
it even
nowhere
harder.
to live.
Yes, exactly.
I think maybe this is something we talked about last time is strengthening the mentorship program, especially within the rural communities where you might not have that many teachers within a district. But building those relationships between, I think, the different districts. So even if you don't have a mentor at your school, you still have someone you can check in with. Um, and I so far the mentorship program that we've done with the university, OPI, has been really successful. It's only its third year and it's basically has been a pilot program, but it's been growing. Um, and so far the schools that have had the student teachers in, a lot of them have hired those students who are now teachers, and they actually had a lot more classroom experience and they get to swoop right into the community that they've already started to build roots in. So I think strengthening that and making sure that there's a focus on the rural communities within that um, can help with some of that loneliness in that community. And maybe even having community mentors that are not teachers, but if someone's moving to a rural community that are not from, having like that's where the volunteers can come in. Like there's someone retired, they want to step up and be like, let me introduce you to the community of what there is to do. There has to be
Great
something to
idea.
do. But
Yeah.
that's a way you can bring the community members in. And I think that serves more than one purpose too, because we talked about the levies failing. And I do think there's a disconnect between like the schools and the communities, and building that back up is going to take like, it will take a while, but I think we all see the need in that and the lack of it. And I think that's also why I think parents and teachers get apprehensive of each other because there's tension. And but I think if we start to bring the community in more, I think that can help build those bridges and then make people more apt to support a levy and more understanding of the needs of that school. Like, no, we really do need to do this because we need to replace all the computers,
And I
whatever
think
that's.
like having an attitude in a conversation like what you were just saying, like I think that's so hugely important because so many people get on the education side are getting so defensive because it's like a constant attack, right? And then the community feels totally unwelcome or insecure about even entering the building or being there. And it's just kind of this like
Oh,
enemy.
absolutely.
And it's
That was one of
not,
the biggest things that I heard last fall. It's funny
yeah,
you should say that was that parents were like, I don't feel welcome in there.
yeah. And
And
that
then teachers
stinks.
were like, I just feel like I'm being judged. And I'm like, whoa, we have a big invisible wall here that just
Yeah.
needs to come down,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think it's important, like I said that there's not a legislative fix to that, but there's ways that we can continue to talk about it and help facilitate those conversations. And people just have to open the door, even if it's uncomfortable.
Well, and I think
We'll get
even
through it.
like I think it was Boulder, a school in Boulder, that used part of their funds to hire a temporary position, so a person in charge of family engagement. And I got to talk to this person. I was doing research and I found their website. I was like, man, they're doing a lot of really cool stuff. And not even things that cost a lot of money, but they were like, they would have a night where parents could come in and learn how to use Infinite Campus to check their kids' grades and, you know, all those kinds of things. And they would be like, look, we're just going to do taco in a bag and sponsor
Pay the
it.
lunch bill.
Yep, everybody comes in. It's super low key. They did trivia nights. So they had the community come in and they did trivia nights. They came in and had reading mornings where parents could come in and everybody got to pick a spot in the gym and they would go read with their kids. Like all of these things. And I was like, oh, that is so amazing. And it brought parents into the school. But I
I
know
love
that
that last one too, because it doesn't put any extra responsibility on teachers or staff
yes,
to be there outside of
Yep.
hours too.
exactly. And that's the thing is, I was like, there needs to be more things like that. But I feel like staff are stressed out. There's a lack of resources. And so those things just aren't a focal point. Like, it's just easier to keep parents out of the school. And I'm like, no, you know, do a free lunch day. That was one thing I pitched our superintendent. I was like, do a free lunch day. Let parents come into the school and see what the kids are eating for lunch. So when their kids come home and are like, oh, lunch is crap, their parents are gonna be like, no, that's not. That's a really good meal, you know, and just getting them in the door so they feel more comfortable to keep coming in. But I do think there's a need for, you know, whether it's like a different, like a grant, you know, or whatever, just to improve that community engagement, because I know at least where we are, there's a lot of people that feel like, oh, I went to the basketball game. I'm like, that's great, but that's not the same thing. Like, you have to do more than that.
That's honestly even where I could see Wendy Fawns, who also works at OPI, was on a group yesterday. What she brought up was, how do you utilize the volunteers? I even see like a family engagement person could be a part of the community and volunteers try to be that facilitator, you know, in between the teachers and community. Um, that could be a type of volunteer position. Maybe there is a grant program where, and it's a small amount of money, but maybe they get a tiny amount of money to host things like that. And it could be such a tiny amount of money that it's not like drop in the bucket in the grand scheme of things, but it could help facilitate a lot of other things. And that
Well, and I
the
was sorry, I
community
was just gonna
engagement. So
say, yeah, there's a lot of local places that people would be surprised, you know, like co-ops, like Farmers Union and CHS and Columbia Grain and Triangle and Northwestern and like places like that, that they love those things, you know, and they do. Like there might be small ones where it's only $500, but $500 goes a long way. That could do a handful of events, you know, and stuff like that to fund those things. So
that's, you know, it's something that we don't think about enough. But yeah, those corporate guys, they like
it's a
CHS.
tax, it's a tax
CHS, I know
write-off.
for a fact, has money to go around. I think they're like
Yep.
one of the largest privately held companies in America. It's crazy.
Yep.
So we are hitting that hour mark. I really enjoyed our discussion tonight. There's a lot of resources in the share drive, the summaries on the website, along with this video will be up on the website tomorrow. What I'm going to do is, based on our conversation today and the previous time, prepare another document that goes more towards kind of categories of what we're looking at for the final white paper. But if there's anything you guys can think of, in the meantime, you want more information on, that you can't find online, I can try to pull from OPI or anything like that, please let me know. Other than that, just if you think of anything, just let me know in the meantime. Otherwise, we'll see each other virtually in July.
Are you okay if we like? Can we add to that too if we come across a resource? You might have just.
Oh yeah, no, that's
okay,
the point.
awesome.
Yes, no,
Awesome.
put
I
whatever.
thought so, but I'm like, I'm gonna double
I
check.
mean,
I haven't found
have to
anything.
say this, but as long as it's appropriate, you know what I mean?
It would be
Um,
tax related.
As
Yes.
long as it's a relatively like related and appropriate, please. That's why I created those share drives so you could throw like, hey, check out this article. The problem nowadays, there's so much resources out there that you can keep reading and researching forever, and eventually you have to be like, okay, I think I know enough at least to understand it.
Yeah.
And none of us will become budget experts in this, but we still at least can put good ideas out there, and the legislature knows where the community feels, and it's like, these are the things that are important to us.
Yeah. Yep. Awesome. Cool.
Cool.
Well, thank
Well,
you.
everyone enjoy the rest of their night, the warm weather.
Yeah. All right. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.